My name is Sarah. I'm 29 years old, and the last thing my mother whispered to me before I walked into the most important room of my life was, "Don't embarrass us tonight." She said it the way she always said things to me, quietly, through a smile. So, no one nearby would hear the edge underneath. My father stood just behind her, adjusting his cufflinks, not even looking at me. They were already scanning the room, looking for people worth talking to, people who mattered, people who were not me, what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, because they had stopped paying attention to my life years ago, was that every single person in that ballroom was there because of me. The gala, the hospital wing, the keynote address, all of it, built from nothing, by the woman they had just told not to embarrass them. 40 minutes later, I would walk onto that stage while my parents sat in the third row. I would watch my mother's champagne glass freeze halfway to her lips. I would watch my father go very, very still. And I would stand at that podium, look out at 400 of the city's most influential people, and tell a story I had never told publicly before. A true one. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I tell you what happened that night, I want to pause for just a moment. If this story is already resonating with you, if something in those first few sentences felt familiar, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to this channel. And I'd genuinely love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. That small connection matters more than you know. Now, let me take you back. I grew up in a house that had all the right furniture and almost none of the right warmth. My parents were not monsters, in the traditional sense. They worked, they kept the lights on, they showed up to certain things. But there were 2 children in that house, and only one of them was ever truly seen. My brother Daniel was 3 years older than me, and golden, in the way that some people simply are, not because of anything they earned, but because someone decided early on that they would be. My parents made that decision about Daniel before I was old enough to understand what it meant. By the time I was 7, the pattern was already fixed. I remember the week I won the regional science competition. I was 10 years old. I had spent 6 weeks building a water filtration model out of materials I gathered myself, because when I asked for a small budget, my mother said they were stretched thin. I won first place. My teacher called the house. My father answered, said, "That's nice," and hung up to take Daniel to baseball practice. A practice Daniel had complained about all morning. That night, at dinner, my parents talked about Daniel's upcoming tournament for 45 minutes. My ribbon sat on the counter by the fruit bowl. No one moved it. No one mentioned it. By morning, it had somehow ended up in the recycling bin. I told myself it must have been an accident for a very long time. That was the year I learned to take up less space, not dramatically, not all at once. It happened the way most quiet damage happens, gradually, then completely. I stopped announcing things. I stopped waiting by the door when I came home from school, hoping someone would ask about my day. I moved through that house like a guest who had already overstayed her welcome, trying very hard not to inconvenience anyone. The word for what I was becoming, though I wouldn't have it until much later, was invisible. and I became very, very good at it. What none of us understood then was that invisibility, practiced long enough, eventually teaches you to see everything. The moment that officially broke something between my family and me didn't happen dramatically. It happened on a Tuesday, in a conference room at my father's office building, during what my mother had called a family meeting. I was 22, I had just graduated, with honors, on a partial scholarship I had applied for myself, in a program my parents had told me was ambitious for someone like you. I had also, in my final semester, been offered a position at a small but reputable nonprofit, working in healthcare access. It wasn't glamorous. It paid $31,000 a year, but it was mine. I had earned it, and for the first time in my life, I felt the specific joy of being chosen by something I actually wanted. Daniel, meanwhile, had been struggling. His business venture, the one my parents had financed, to the tune of $60,000, the one I had been told we couldn't afford to help me with in any comparable way, had collapsed. And in its collapse, Daniel had done something that I knew about, and my parents did not yet. He had forged a vendor contract using my name, my student email address, to make his company look more legitimate than it was. I found out by accident through a forwarded email thread 3 weeks before the family meeting. I went to that meeting, planning to tell the truth. I walked in, sat down, and within 4 minutes, my mother told me that the family had decided Daniel needed support right now, and that it would mean a great deal if I could step back from my job offer, defer it by a year, to help him rebuild. They had already spoken to someone about a position for me at Daniel's friend's firm, something more stable. I took a breath. I told them about the contract. I showed them the email thread on my phone. I was calm. I wasn't angry. I simply laid out what had happened, the way you present evidence when you still believe truth matters. My mother looked at the screen, then looked at Daniel, then looked at me, and said, "Why would you bring this up right now?" Not, "Is this true?" Not, "Daniel, did you do this?" Just, "Why would you bring this up right now?" My father said I was being dramatic. Daniel said I had always been jealous of him, and just like that, the truth I had carried carefully across 3 weeks was repackaged as my personality flaw. They told me I was too sensitive, that I always made things about myself, that they didn't want drama. I sat very still. I didn't cry. Something in me had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that happens, not when you lose, but when you finally understand the rules of the game and realize you were never meant to win it. I left that evening with my bag, my diploma, and the clarity is so cold, it almost felt like peace. There was no dramatic door slam, no final shouting match, just me, walking to my car, in the dark, while the lights in the house stayed on, and no one came to the window. The silence of that moment taught me more about my family than 22 years of living with them ever had. The first apartment I rented in the new city had a radiator that clanged every night at 2 a.m., a window that didn't close all the way, and a landlord who spelled my name wrong on the lease. I loved it because it was mine. Every single thing is wrong with it was mine. I worked 3 part-time jobs in the first year, a coffee shop in the mornings, data entry in the afternoons, waitressing on weekends. I kept a notebook where I wrote down every dollar I made and every dollar I spent. Not because I was disciplined by nature, but because I had learned early that when no one is coming to save you, you save yourself, or you don't get saved. It was at the coffee shop during a slow Wednesday morning shift that I met Margaret. She was 63 years old, a recently retired hospital administrator who came in every morning at 8, ordered the same black coffee, and spent an hour reading before the rest of the world woke up. I don't remember exactly how we started talking. I think I made a comment about her book, and she laughed in a way that made the whole room feel warmer. She started asking me questions, real ones, the kind that required actual answers. What are you working toward? What do you actually care about? What's stopping you? Nobody had asked me those questions before. Not like that. Not with the expectation that my answers would be worth something. Margaret had spent 30 years building programs that brought healthcare resources to underserved communities. She had navigated boardrooms and budget cuts and bureaucracies that seemed designed to exhaust people into giving up. And she had not given up. She saw something in me that I was still learning to see in myself. Within 6 months, she had introduced me to her network, helped me understand how nonprofit infrastructure actually worked, and sat across from me at her kitchen table, more times than I can count, going line by line through grant applications, with a patience that felt almost unfamiliar to me. Because it was unconditional. She didn't help me because I was useful to her. She helped me because she believed that what I wanted to build mattered. That was the first time in my adult life that someone's belief in me had no strings attached. The psychological term for what Margaret gave me is unconditional acceptance. I didn't have a word for it then. I just knew it felt nothing like home, and everything like what home was supposed to be. Over the next 5 years, I built the foundation slowly, the way you build anything real, without shortcuts, without anyone handing me a head start. The Sarah Chen Foundation focused on healthcare access for uninsured families. We started with one program in one clinic. By year 3, we had partnerships with 7 hospitals across the state. By year 5, we'd funded over 40 community health initiatives, and I had been named one of the top nonprofit executives under 35 in the country. Margaret cried when she read that article. I told her not to. She told me to stop telling her what to do. And we laughed, the way people laugh, when they've built something together that neither of them could have built alone. Meanwhile, I heard things through distant relatives, the way you always do. Daniel's second business had also failed. My parents had moved to a smaller house. My mother had started dropping my name at social events. Vaguely, carefully, the way you reference something you're not sure you still own. I noted all of it and kept building. The Hargrove Medical Gala was the city's most prestigious healthcare fundraiser, held every year at the Whitmore Grand Hotel in a ballroom that could hold 400 people and made every single one of them feel like they were exactly where they were supposed to be. I had anonymously funded the naming rights to the new children's wing of Hargrove Memorial Hospital. $2 million, raised over 3 years, through the foundation. The hospital board had asked me to be the keynote speaker to formally accept the dedication at the gala. I said yes, and asked that my name be kept off the printed program, listed only as a distinguished guest speaker until the moment of introduction. I had my reasons. I arrived early, before the crowds, in a navy gown that Margaret had insisted on, and I was standing near the lobby's east corridor, reviewing my notes on my phone, when I heard a voice I had not heard in 4 years. Sarah. My mother. She was dressed well. She and my father had clearly made an effort. Daniel was beside her, in a suit that was slightly too formal for the occasion, the way things always were with Daniel, slightly off, in ways he couldn't quite identify. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then my mother smiled, the careful smile, and said, "What are you doing here?" Not warmly, not with guilt, with the mild alarm of someone who has spotted a variable they hadn't accounted for. I told her I was attending the event. My father looked me over once, the way he always had, measuring something, and finding it slightly wanting. He said, "This is a very important evening for us. We're hoping to connect with the Hargrove board. There's a naming opportunity we've been pursuing." He straightened his tie and said, almost as an afterthought, "Just don't embarrass us tonight, Sarah." There it was, the same words, the same quiet edge underneath. I'm 29 years old, running a multi-million-dollar foundation. And I was still, in their eyes, the variable to be managed. I looked at my father for a long moment. I said, "I'll do my best," and I walked toward the ballroom. An hour later, the room was full, 400 people in formal wear, champagne and soft orchestral music, the warm hum of people who had gathered around something that mattered. I sat at the head table, facing the room. My parents were 3 rows back. I could see them, working the table. My father leaned in to introduce himself to someone. My mother laughing at the right moments, networking, the way they had always wanted to, in rooms like this. Then the board chair, Dr. Eleanor Voss, stepped to the podium, and the room settled. She spoke about the new wing, about what it would mean for the families it would serve, about the donor who had made it possible. And then she said, "It is my extraordinary honor to introduce the founder of the Sarah Chen Foundation and the woman whose generosity built the wing we dedicate tonight. Please welcome Sarah Chen." I stood, and I watched. My mother's champagne glass stopped, halfway to her lips. My father's hand, which had been reaching for a bread roll, went very still. Daniel looked from the stage to my parents, and back to the stage, his face cycling through 3 expressions in about 2 seconds. I walked to the podium. I adjusted the microphone. I looked out at 400 people, and I took one slow breath, and then I looked, briefly, at table 31, row 3, and I began. If you were in my shoes, would you have acknowledged them from the stage? Type yes or no in the comments right now. I want to know. I want to tell you something that I have never said publicly before tonight. The Sarah Chen Foundation exists because of a wrong that was never corrected. When I was 22 years old, my brother used my identity, my name, my credentials, to fraudulently extend the life of a failing business. When I brought that truth to my family, I was told I was dramatic. I was told I was jealous. I was told I was too sensitive. And then I was quietly removed from the family, the way you remove something inconvenient from a room you want to look clean. What I did not know at the time was that this was not the first time. My family had operated this way. My father, 30 years ago, had built his early career on the back of a business partner whose contributions he systematically erased from the record. A man named Robert Ewan, who co-founded the firm my father would later claim as entirely his own. Robert Ewan, who signed over his shares under pressure during a contract dispute he could not afford to litigate. Robert Ewan, who spent the next decade trying to rebuild, and whose daughter is tonight the chair of the Hargrove Hospital Ethics Committee, sitting in this very room. I turned slightly toward Dr. Linda Ewan, who was seated at the far left table, and I said, "Linda, your father deserved better, and I'm sorry it took this long for someone to say that in a room full of people who needed to hear it." The room was completely silent. I did not look at table 31. I didn't need to. I could feel it, the specific silence of people who have just realized the thing they buried did not stay buried. I continued my speech. I talked about the families the new wing would serve. I talked about Margaret. I thanked the board. I thanked the staff of the foundation. And when I was finished, the room stood. I walked off that stage, and I went directly to the water station in the East Corridor, because my mouth was dry, and I needed a moment of absolute ordinary calm. They found me there, 3 minutes later, my mother first, then my father. Daniel waited near the door. My mother spoke first. She said, "Sarah, we had no idea you were. We didn't know the extent of..." She stopped, started again. "What you've built is remarkable. We always believed in you." I held my water glass with both hands, and I looked at her, with all the calm I had spent 7 years building. And I said, "No, you didn't. And that's okay. But I need you to understand something. I'm not available for a relationship that only becomes possible because I became someone you can benefit from." My father started to speak. I raised one hand, gently. "I'm not angry. I want you to hear that. I'm genuinely not angry. But what happened in that conference room 7 years ago, what happened my entire childhood, was real, and it caused real damage. That doesn't disappear. Because the room is nicer now." Daniel started to say something about moving forward. I looked at him, just once, and he stopped. My mother's eyes filled. My father looked at the floor, and I said, the last thing I would say to them that evening, "I wish you well. I genuinely do. But wishing someone well and letting them back into your life are two different things. And I've learned the hard way to know the difference." I set my water glass down, and I walked back into the ballroom, where Margaret was waiting at the head table. She didn't ask what happened in the corridor. She just handed me a glass of water and said, "You did good, kid." And that was enough. That has always been enough. Here is what I want to leave you with. The word scapegoat comes from an ancient ritual where a community's sins were symbolically placed on a single animal, which was then driven out into the wilderness, so the community could feel clean. That is what I was in my family, the place where blame was stored, so everyone else could feel absolved. Parentification, the scapegoat role, conditional love dressed up as family loyalty. These are not just psychological terms. They are descriptions of a pattern that is more common than most people admit, and more damaging than most families ever acknowledge. If you grew up in a house like mine, I want you to know something. The exit from that pattern is not revenge. It is not a dramatic confrontation. It is not waiting for an apology that may never come. The exit is this: building something so entirely your own that their opinions of it become irrelevant. Finding people who love you without keeping score, and understanding deeply in the part of you that took the longest to heal. That setting boundaries isn't cruelty, it isn't bitterness, it isn't even strength. Exactly. It is simply survival. And you are allowed to survive. You are allowed to thrive. You are allowed to walk into a room that you built with your own hands and stand at the front of it and take up every single inch of the space that was always yours. My name is Sarah. I'm 29 years old, and I finally stopped making myself small for people who were never going to see me anyway. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it. And remember, you don't need their permission to become who you already are.